Hey everyone, welcome back to OTD Canadian Military History. Back again with guests for the first one for 2023, I guess. As a lot of you know, January is quite busy, so excited to get first guest back on the channel for the new year. Guest today has been on twice now. Great supporter of the channel, always does a great presentation, covers a wide variety of topics, as you're going to learn another one tonight. And this is another one of his specialties, professionally speaking as well. So it's going to be good, and this is an interesting operation. And I'll let our guest today, Dave, take it all off from there. But if you like the work I'm doing, if you consider becoming a supporter through YouTube or Patreon, that would be great to help me keep going, and then do more of this as the year goes along. So we're just going to get it going. So thanks for coming back, Dave. I appreciate it, and getting a chance to talk about Veritable is always an interesting operation.
Oh, for sure. Well, no, thanks to you for having me, actually. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is, as you mentioned in one of our emails, I think this is the OTD hat trick that I'm scoring here today. Thanks. So I appreciate that. Do you have like a five timers club like Saturday Night Live has?
I could. Something. I think you and Carla Jean Stokes are up at the top. So I think we could do your own playlist. That's what I could do. I think when you hit 3, you get your own.
Oh, nice. Okay. I
think that's just a rule. I just so.
Do you get the nice smoking jacket with the OTD crest on it and everything?
Get out my budget for that, but I'll consider it potentially in the future. So, so thanks again. You've done stuff after Red River and Winnipeg Falcons. Now we're going across the water and looking at something that you obviously have a professional connection to. So, again, as you know, I like to ask before we kind of jump into the slideshow, which is amazing, by the way. Why Veritable? Why is this one you wanted to focus on? I think I know the answer, but I still kind of want to get your 2 cents on it.
Sure. Well, and it's funny. We were talking before you went live. That's what that big why slide is for. I was going to explain why Veritable and why the artillery bombardment.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, there we go. Actually, if you just pause here, I think what I'd like to just share is the title that I chose here. And if you or any of the folks watching haven't already checked out my article, I strongly recommend it. So I wrote an article for Canadian Military History Journal about the bombardment. And that's what this presentation is based on, that article and the research that went into that article. And as you know, I'm sure, and as every historian knows, you go through primary source documents, and every now and again you find a quote that just kind of rolls off the tongue. Yeah. So I was going through the Army historical reports for Operation Veritable, and kind of tucked away at the bottom of the sentence was some Army historical officer's analysis of the fire plan, and he wrote, they executed it with a calculated and terrible efficiency. And so I immediately wrote that down. I said, that's the title right there. And then I almost backward engineered it. I kind of said, I found the title. Now I'm going to write the article around the title. Yeah. But that's where the title comes from. And as we see, as we go through, there's a very good reason why he wrote that. And we'll get into some of the technical details going forward, but everything that had to come together in order to actually make this fire plan work.
Yeah, so I was going to say that you discovered that kind of first is rare, because I know I had to, most things I got to dig backwards and be like, oh, is this going to work? Is that cool? Does that sound good? So having something fall into your lap is kind of the historian dream with titles.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, especially something that is accurate, but also that kind of attention grabbing. Speaking of attention grabbing.
There it is. Yeah. So, as you know, as every self-help guru says, and I take this from Simon Sinek, if you've read any of his stuff, start with why. So why are you doing something? And why did this interest me? And that's the question you asked me right off the top. And it's because, well, for one thing, just for pure historical interest, Operation Veritable was the largest offensive operation conducted by 1st Canadian Army during the Second World War. So at one point, there was 450,000 soldiers in that organization. Granted, when we look at the org chart and the divisions and the corps that were in the Army, it was a Canadian in name only, maybe, I guess you could say. And certainly the commander was Canadian, the senior staff were Canadian, and obviously there was a Canadian Corps, but you know, it included a lot of Brits, Poles, and some Dutch as well, I believe. So it was a massive undertaking, and so just for that, it's worthwhile study the Operation Veritable Fire Plan. But also from an artillery perspective, this was up until the crossing of the Rhine, which happened several weeks later after this. This was the largest artillery bombardment, artillery fire plan conducted by Imperial, however you want to phrase it, Imperial or Commonwealth forces during the Second World War. Everybody said it was bigger than El Alamein. That was the phrase that everybody used. It's bigger than El Alamein, because up to that point, El Alamein had been the show. And when it came to artillery bombardments. So that interests me. Just the fact that it was big, I thought would be interesting. But then when I started reading more about it, I realized that there was a lot more aspects to it than just the fact that it was big. And unfortunately, as I'm a gunner officer, and so I'm naturally inclined to artillery things. But as a gunner officer with a historical inclination as well, I kind of over the years have realized that when we discuss the artillery's role in most military histories, it's relegated to one or two single facts: the number of guns that were fired and how long the bombardment is. And what the story that doesn't tell is everything that had to fall into place for that bombardment to happen, especially a large one. So and we'll see the stats a little later, we had the 1st Canadian Army had over 1,000 guns supporting it for this. So when you think about that, a gun detachment is anywhere from 7 to 10 people. So do the math there. That's just the gun part. There's also command posts. There's the forward observation officers and the OPs. There's all the sustainment elements that come along with that. So we're now looking at, probably tens of thousands of men organized towards one end goal. And the work that has to go into that to coordinate it, to plan it, to get the ammunition to the right place, to plan where the fire is going to go, then do all the math calculations to make sure the bullets are going to go there. A gun doesn't just drive up, plop, and then start shooting. There's a whole series of things that have to happen leading up to that. So I felt that story doesn't get told very often. And that's what I want to dive into here. Now, I'll apologize to anybody, because obviously these inside baseball facts about the artillery that really gets me salivating, because it's super interesting. And it may not be as interesting to as many people, but I want to try to keep it as interesting as possible. I understand why the narratives focus almost exclusively on the infantry and the armor. That's the elan, that's the shock troop, that shock action. And I don't by any means want to denigrate what an infantry soldier or an armored tanker goes through, or an engineer for that matter. And I'm not here to argue one arm is more important than the other. But what I do want to do is shed some light on this, in this particular case, in the Veritable case, this absolute massive organization that had to be coordinated down to the last detail to actually work. So there's that. But also from a historical interest perspective, and we'll get into this, is novel weapons were introduced, whether it's the proximity fuse or the VT fuse. We'll talk about that. The rocket battery and some other tactics as well. And I guess the final bit is I do also want to highlight the challenges that the gunners had. So you'll see when you start trying to plant 1,000 guns in a stretch of terrain that's only kind of 6 miles by 2 miles, it gets pretty crowded pretty quickly. And then add the flood into it, the melting snow. So suddenly the artillery problem becomes much more of a challenge. So in 1,000 words, I guess that's why I wanted to write this article and why I wanted to share the story with everybody.
No, I think that's it's hard to, yeah, it's hard to sum that one up because just there's so much here. And I guess this is going to come up a bunch from probably just me, but this isn't as well known as it should be, as I've said, even in the past, but just the detail and everything that gone into this. And I'm sure, and I know a lot of people watching like the logistical stuff and understanding those other parts that go into these things. It's not just, the exciting stuff, at the sharp end, if you will, but more, how does this get here? And I think Veritable is a perfect case for that. So I think it's and then you're probably a perfect candidate to take us through this. So do you want to keep going?
Yes, please. All right. As always, you need to start with a strategic situation to understand where everything's happening. So I stole this map off the internet. This was focused on Operation Market Garden. So obviously, by the time frame we're talking about, Market Garden was over, but it gives a good idea of what the situation was. And where the 1st Canadian Army was located. And you can see it located kind of up there at the very top of the map. So I don't want to go into the success or not success of Market Garden, but regardless of whatever the case was, this is how they were arrayed. And 21st Army Group under Montgomery was poised to drive into the Ruhr region of Germany. So as you know, we fought through Normandy, now fought through the Low Countries. Market Garden was an attempt to kind of punch into Germany. Bit of a sputter there, and now so this is a sequel operation, and in early December, Montgomery gave the warning order to Career Art to prepare for an operation into, if you see where the red arrow is, into that region to clear the Germans out of between the Meuse and the Rhine rivers there, and that was intended to be the next phase, which would then lead to a crossing of the Rhine and drive into the Ruhr region, which you can see to the right of the map. So that's the strategic situation we have. But if you look in the bottom right of the map, you'll see OB West under the command of Rundstedt is there, and he's going to throw a cog into the wheel of everything here, which is on the next slide.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Yeah. So despite all their plans, so imagine this Career and his staff, they're all excited about this. They've got this operation planned. So they start cobbling everything together, making preparations. And then on the 16th of December, von Rundstedt launches his Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. So, once the Allies realized what was happening, they realized that this was the problem that needed to be solved first before they considered carrying on. So Montgomery essentially called up Harry Career and said, sorry, he had given him 30 corps for this assault into the Veritable operation area. And he said, sorry, I got to pull him back. So he pulled back General Horrocks and 30 Corps, transferred them to 2nd British Army, and then asked 1st Canadian Army to kind of be the hard left shoulder while the 2nd Army and the Americans dealt with the Ardennes offensive. So Veritable was put on hiatus. Everybody just kind of held their spot. Most of 2 Canadian Corps, especially the 2nd Canadian Division, essentially held what was going to be the line of departure for Veritable. And fortunately, most of the German offensive was south of them, so they were able to hold it. And as you can see there, the final bullet, the 1st Canadian Army was left with the 1 British Corps and the 2nd Canadian Corps being the kind of a left shoulder of 21 Army Group.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one too. Just want to jump in real quick because,
of course, yeah,
they didn't necessarily start 1st Canadian Army. They were told to prepare that you're going to be hit too. So I think that's something to also keep in mind for this because, I mean, that's one of the things I think you would assume, but I literally saw the order while researching this a couple of years back. Yeah. So it's really, really interesting to keep that in mind, and especially as we see going forward with how Veritable comes off.
Mm-hmm. So the German offensive is defeated by around mid-January, and Montgomery says, "All right, now we've taken care of that. Returned 30 Corps to 1st Canadian Army, and they turned Veritable back on. And just to give you more of an idea of what was going on around, you can see in that map that Veritable was going to be it's going to not necessarily converge, but kind of coincide with Operation Grenade, which was a simultaneous offensive by the 9th U.S. Army, as well. The 2nd British Army, which was kind of to their west, was meant to hold the Germans in place while this was all happening. And the original D-Day was scheduled for 10 February, but then moved forward to 8 February, 78 years ago today. Mm-hmm. So Veritable's back on, and the planning, I think they always kind of kept planning. Although, as you said, if they were preparing for potentially being attacked as part of the Ardennes offensive, doubtless that was their priority. But somebody went and dusted off the plans they had started with a month previous and said, "All right, let's try this again." Yeah.
I think it's just an interesting element of this. I don't know, maybe there's not much there, but I think it's so interesting because I think it was a combination of both. Because I mean. Mm-hmm. I've looked at this for like the OTD posts, and I did a thing with Project 44 on Bulge a long time ago, a couple of years ago. So, and I looked at all these from different angles. So it's really interesting because you get a kind of sense of what Krieger's thinking, right? He's like, oh no, we're going to be attacked, but we still have to do Veritable. Like it was always, I think, on his mind. But like you said, I don't think it was necessarily always the focus of even, say, his staff. But it's always at the back, seemingly, of Krieger's mind. But again, we don't have much writings for him, so I guess that's kind of speculation. But it just seemed to be, in the way I was reading some of those documents, that this is kind of what he wants. It's like almost a show got stolen from him, almost. Yeah, a little bit. But
and I can understand that, like the fact that we had an army in the field and the fact that all these formations were handed to him and it was going to be a pretty big show, I can understand why he'd be very excited about doing it. And no doubt he was probably chomping at the bit to go back on the offensive.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So I chose this slide because I think it shows very kind of it's a good indicator of what the ground looked like. And what you can see here is the Germans had defensive positions lined up. So this is also, it's very important to note that it's what you might call, a term we use now is called complex terrain, in that it's not wide rolling plains. It's not like the prairies of Canada or anything where tanks can drive for hours and hours and hours and you've got long lines of sites. This region is one of rolling hills, dense forests. As you can see, a flooding river to the north, rivers to the river to the west, and in particular the German national forest, the Reichwald, which is just kind of not far from the land of Archer. Interesting here. So a few things that I wanted to highlight just on this slide is, number one, the flooding that you see to the north. Yep. So that was caused by, one, deliberately the Germans flooded it by blowing a dam on the Walla River to flood the northern approaches. And sadly, for second and third Canadian divisions, they bore the brunt of the water. Oh, yeah. But also, if you take a look at the defenses as they were prepared, it shows you the way that the Germans were anticipating the advance. So all of those defensive lines, are oriented more westerly and not necessarily to the northwest, which is by Nijmegen, and even though they were still effective for that direction, they were obviously not deliberately put in that direction. And we'll hit on this several times, but there was a key part of this operation was surprise. Yes. And the Krieger and his staff went to great lengths to hide the fact that where they were was where the offensive would come from, and they were actually quite successful in that as well. And just I'll hit a few points while I'm here. Like for example, no British forces were allowed to actually come forward to the line of departure, or if they did. Believe it or not, they actually had to be outfitted with Canadian uniforms. Absolutely no British vehicles were allowed to in the area. So if a Brit, from whatever 51st Scottish or the Wessex division, or sorry, the Welsh 53rd Welsh division, wanted to reconnoiter the line of departure or something like that, he had to put a Canadian uniform on and be driven around by Canadian soldiers. So that's just one example, and we'll see more about how important it was for surprise. I see somebody made a comment that an early spring thaw affected it, and it certainly did. Yeah, there was a number of things that that interfered with things. We'll talk more when they started assembling the artillery. Most of the guns were still 50 to 100 kilometers away and had to make their way through these sodden roads that were now either flooded through the flooding of the river or the natural springs, the early spring thaw that just made movement horrible. And the last point I want to highlight here is just the towns of Cleve and Goch and some of the other ones that are there. So the Germans also essentially turned every one of those towns into a fortress. Yeah. So you've got prepared defenses, rolling hills that can be exploited, forests, and then reinforced strong points, essentially, all standing in the way of advance. And not a lot of room to maneuver, a very, very narrow frontage to actually go. So, as Horrocks once said, there was no scope to be clever. So, essentially, what you're going to see is artillery became key because he wasn't going to be able to kind of maneuver through that and be clever. He had to actually blast his way through it. So same slide, well, same picture gives you an idea of the maneuver plan. So on the left there you have Harry Carrera, and on the right General Horrocks, the commander of 30 Corps. So in 1st Canadian Army, 1st British Corps, 2nd Canadian Corps, and 3rd British Corps were the subordinate formations. But as you can see there, the intent that they devised was phase 1 was essentially going to be a 1 Corps, 5 division assault. So it's hard to see on this slide, but essentially moving from south to north, you have 51 Highland Division, 53 Welsh, 15 Scottish, 2nd Canadian, and 3rd Canadian. Yep. Those were all on the line of departure. They all fell under 30 Corps for phase 1 of the operation. The intent, once they had progressed beyond Cleve to a point, the 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions were going to return under command of Simmons and 2nd Corps, 2nd Canadian Corps, and thereafter the remainder of the anticipated operation was going to be controlled by the Army, with 2 corps moving in parallel, 30 Corps on the right, 2nd Canadian on the left. So that in general was the maneuver plan. Should also mention that in reserve was the 43 Wessex and Guards Armored Divisions that they had plans to pass through British divisions once they were combat ineffective and carry on the advance. So that was the plan, and it was an ambitious plan. And you can see in that slide, it's hard to see, but the shaded areas give a rough idea of where phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 were going to be. And it does broaden a bit beyond the phase 1 area so that you could have a 2 Corps advance, but it's still pretty narrow, especially with the flooding in the north.
Yeah, very narrow. That's the thing we want to specify, but we'll get there as we move into the actual plan itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we get into the good stuff, the artillery aspect. So, of course, the maneuver plan has to come first. And the maneuver plan should always consider the availability of artillery in order to influence the maneuver plan. But the primary role of the artillery is to support the maneuver commander. So the maneuver plan the fire plan needs to accommodate the maneuver commander as much as possible. So what you see on the top there is Brigadier E.C. Plow, who is the Brigadier Royal Artillery of the 1st Canadian Army. So if anyone's not familiar with those titles, the Brigadier Royal Artillery was the senior gunner in an army. In a British Canadian Army. So he was actually Canadian, and I think he ended up being, after the war, he was Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia or something.
Yes.
I can't. So.
I believe so. Yeah.
One of those outlying maritime provinces. He was the BRA, so he had overall command of the artillery. But because it was for phase one, it was a 30 corps show. Most of that was delegated to 30 Corps and the commander, Corps Royal Artillery, Brigadier Stu Rollins, who you see in the bottom photo there. So at that point, the BRA, his job was just to make sure all the guns were in place and where they needed to be, and in order to enable 30 Corps. So the 30 Corps artillery commander was more responsible for the actual coordination and ensuring the bullets are landing in the right place. So when they devised their fire plan, there were three objectives, and I've highlighted some key points here. And I'm going to start artillery geeking out right around here. So the three objectives of the fire plan were to neutralize all known enemy batteries, the counter battery fight, destroy headquarters and communications, and suppress the enemy in the line of advance. And these are key. These are three effects that artillery achieves: neutralize, destroy, and suppress. And they have very specific definitions as to what they actually mean. Neutralize simply means that the target is it's neutralized, but that means it's damaged and it can't affect you for a pretty long period until it's reinforced or its equipment is replaced or anything like that. So that's what neutralization means. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's destroyed. Of course, destroyed means destroyed. I won't get into the finer details of in modern doctrine what percentage constitutes whether a target is destroyed or not. But for our purposes here, destroyed is destroyed. It means it's no longer there. Although, admittedly, for like a target, like a company or a platoon or something like that, to achieve destroy, you don't necessarily need to kill everybody in it. But at least it cannot continue. It needs to be pulled out of the line, and it is no longer combat effective. Neutralize is similar, however, it can be reinforced and replaced, and it can still complete its mission after a while. Suppress is a lot more fleeting. Suppress is an effect where the enemy, for the period that he's being suppressed, can't fire his weapon. He's hiding in a dugout. He's not killed, but for the period of the effect, he's not able to execute his combat functions. But it passes as soon as the firing ends, essentially. So those are the three effects. And as we go through the results of the fire plan later on in the presentation, you'll see some people might assume with the size of it that why didn't they just kind of kill all the German? Why it was so big? Why were the number of casualties so small? And we'll come back to that. And it's because we have to find that the role of the artillery wasn't to destroy, as some people think. It was actually more important to suppress during the advance. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. So in order to achieve this, Rollins and Plow divided the fire plan into three phases. Number one, preparatory fire, and Rollins wrote this, the whole intent there was to stupefy enemy defenses, followed by a standing barrage. As I mentioned, secrecy was key. So up until just about H hour, the Germans thought it was only 2nd Canadian Division that was holding that line of departure. So we'll see the actual timing, but as H hour neared, all of those other assaulting divisions had to move forward to the line of departure. So in order to shield them while they were doing this enormous standing barrage dropped just in front of the line of departure. It was a mixture of high explosive and smoke, and it obscured everything so that the Germans couldn't see that the folks were lining up to attack. And then the final phase was this protective creeping barrage where the rounds actually led the troops as they advanced. And you probably remember that any readings from the First World War with Vimy and even in Normandy, barrage was de rigueur. But we'll talk a little bit more about how it had almost fallen out of favor by the time Veritable launched. Those are the grosso modo parts of the fire plan.
Yeah, if we just don't mind real quick,
Sure.
Question from the Great Dominion here about, are different calibers of artillery used to achieve the three objectives? Could the 25-pounders effectively destroy targets?
It depends on the target, obviously. But what we'll see a little later on is that the size of the shell for suppressing the effect, the size of the shell didn't quite matter. if you wanted to destroy something, the heavier the way to fire, the better. And even today, that's the key. So, for example, if you were to fire an 81 millimeter mortar at a platoon defensive position, and if they were dug in, you're probably not going to destroy them, especially if they've got overhead cover or whatnot. But you'll still suppress them. However, if you fired a 155 shell with a delay fuse on it, there is a chance you'll actually destroy those trenches and their overhead protection. So yeah, the different calibers do the ability to destroy increases with the increase in the size of the caliber.
Yes, right. Perfect.
So here's the artillery, and as I kind of alluded to at the start, over 1,000 guns, 938 field, medium, heavy, and super heavy guns that were divided into divisional artilleries and Army Groups Royal Artillery. That's what AGRA stands for. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So you're probably saying, well, it says 938. Why do you keep saying over 1,000? It's because it also included 96 heavy anti-aircraft guns firing in a ground roll. So over 1,000 guns. And you can see how they were allocated in the table on the right of the slide. Every division had its own division, giving it what we call intimate fire support or close support. So 15th Scottish Divisional Artillery supported 15th Scottish Division. But we're going to talk a little bit more later about how their fire can be switched to affect flanking formations as well. And they also had, as you can see here, some other artillery under command, and then medium regiments in support. So essentially, when an artillery formation or artillery regiment is allocated under command, it means that it's kind of the hip pocket artillery of that commander. But in support means they're there and they'll fire in support, but the administration, logistics, moving of them is actually controlled by a higher headquarters. So whereas within the divisional artillery, the Commander Royal Artillery of the 15th Scottish Divisional Artillery could move his own guns in accordance with the needs of the Commander 15th Scottish Division, he couldn't move 84th Medium Regiment because the Corps Artillery actually commanded 84th Medium Regiment, and while they were directing their fire in support of 15th Scottish Division, they couldn't be told where to move, where to go, and their fire could be taken away at any point. Ubique to you as well, Treadhead Pete. So that's how the artillery was arrayed in 30 Corps as they were assaulting over the line of archery.
Yeah, I mean, as many times as I see this for both World Wars, it still boggles my mind. I can see this so many times, and it's still just hard to still wrap my head around with the numbers and the organization and everything. But yeah, I don't want to steal your thunder, but every time I'm still like, just wow, the numbers and everything that goes into this.
It goes back to what I was saying at the start. Like every one of those guns needs to be put somewhere. It's got its own crew. It's got a truck. It's got a limber. Plus, it's got another truck with ammunition on it. Plus, the regiment has trucks. So you start seeing that when you've got a small strip of terrain, you run out of trees to hide behind after a while, and
especially here.
Yeah, for sure. So very, very quickly, by this point, a division. So in the Second World War, in the Modern Canadian Army, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place. The Modern Canadian Army, we use brigade groups, which are various combat arms that are brigaded together. But in the Second World War, the brigade was still kind of a single arm. So there'd be a brigade of infantry, for example. And it wasn't until the division where you saw like all the arms brought together. That doesn't mean that from time to time forces weren't made. They didn't cobble things together. I don't want to suggest that a brigade never functioned with artillery support in it, but from just a normal organizational structure at the division level is where all the arms kind of got cobbled together or started to get cobbled together. The divisional artillery structure is what they landed on. There was changes throughout the year, but the Commander of Royal Artillery commanded a divisional artillery. It was called the Canadian Divisional Artillery and the Canadian Divisions. And later on in the war, we finally, in a fit of pride, I guess, we started calling the CRA the CRCA. But that was later on in the war. And the same thing when we talk about AGRAs, Army Groups Royal Artillery became Army Groups Royal Canadian Artillery. But at this point, we're still calling them CRAs and AGRAs. So you'll see the intimate close artillery support for a Canadian infantry division was 3 field regiments of 24, 25-pounder howitzers, each divided into three batteries of 8 guns, each battery divided into 2 troops of 4. And then there was the anti-tank regiment and a light anti-aircraft regiment. Those were all part of the Canadian divisional artillery in the British Imperial Commonwealth armies. And then, of course, there's more at the corps level. But more importantly, there's AGRAs, which I think is the next slide.
So,
yeah, there it is. So, starting in around 1940, the Imperial forces created what were called Army Groups Royal Artillery. So they are nominally an army asset, but they're almost exclusively allocated to corps. So essentially what was realized early on is that in order to have fire superiority, we needed to have big guns reinforcing your normal divisions. But they wanted to get away from the kind of hiccups that would arise that if they inserted these medium and heavy artillery into divisions, plucking them out and issuing those orders and whatnot. So they created these organizations called Army Groups Royal Artillery, AGRAs, which was this compilation of medium and heavy artillery, which could go as a formation and be allocated to the main effort. So the army could be allocated from army groups, several AGRAs, and they could give the corps, the main effort corps, an AGRA, or they could allocate it to another corps or anything like that. So these were reinforcing guns that were used to beef up the firepower, and also used to a large extent on counter battery fire. And for at one point they were going to be called regimental artillery groups. But some Puritans said the acronym RAG wouldn't go over well, and there'd be too many jokes about it, so they chose the term Army Group Royal Artillery, which doesn't really flow off the tongue either. No. But at least you can't really make a naughty word out of the acronym at the very least. So anyway, there was several Army Groups Royal Artillery, and what you see here is the structure of this is what I took from the Second Canadian AGRA, which is we had one in Italy and one in Northwest Europe, and that's the structure. And I'll highlight that although we had 3 medium regiments, it itself was reinforced with Royal Artillery guns in the 10th Medium and the 1st Heavy Regiment of Royal Artillery. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there are 5 of these organizations were allocated to support 30 Corps. Well, 1st Canadian Army, sorry.
Sorry, I had to do that.
Nice. Okay.
Timing, I didn't have a choice. Okay. There we go.
Yeah. So I found this great picture of people trying to of this map, trying to shoehorn all these guns into locations. And of course, the ranges were anywhere from, depending on the caliber, I would say like 7 to 15,000 yards or what have you, or maybe a bit longer for the super heavy guns. And doctrinally now and then as well, at least 2/3 of that range should be beyond the where your troops are. Yes. So there's no sense being like, if your range is 10,000 yards, there's no sense you being at 9,500. You need to be able to fire well beyond your own troops. So the idea of the artillery being really like kind of sucked in the back and far away from the fighting, it's a bit inaccurate, because now I'm not saying they're right like next to the infanteers on the line of departure or anything like that, but they're not as far back as a lot of people think they were. They were actually pretty well forward, especially when they had counter battery and counter mortar tasks. So that's something to think of. So there you see we had this small strip of land, and we got 1,000 guns to plant in there, plus all their wagon lines, their what we call their A and B echelon vehicles. And so, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody could step on the deck of a truck down in the Niagara area there and just walk from hood to hood to hood to hood to hood all the way up to Nijmegen and never get his boots wet because they're just jam packed in there. And of course, there's infantry and engineers and all the other sustainment stuff of the organization. So I want to go back to the idea of secrecy. These were all, and I'll probably get the dates wrong, but one of the biggest combat indicators of where the main effort's going to be is, as we saw, where the artillery goes. So Crerar was big on surprise and secrecy. So the guns weren't allowed to actually move into position until D-1. Maybe D-2. I think a few came in maybe a bit earlier than that.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So, and they were all like northwest of Nijmegen. They were still coming, but some of them were still coming back from the Ardennes fight, and you know they were in weight areas. So that the move of all the batteries into position was the responsibility of the BRA branch. So Plow and his team. So whereas Rollins was planning how he's going to allocate the fire and how to suppress targets and whatnot, Plow was more concerned with assembling everybody and under this cloak of secrecy. So not only did they have this huge road move to get there at the last possible minute, but it all had to be done at night under cover of darkness.
I was going to say, it's all in the dark. Yeah,
exactly. So limited roads that are flooded, early thaw, they're all muddy, middle of the night, and all these guns had to travel 50 to 100 miles to get there, all to be ready to fire on D-Day at 0500 in the morning. And I don't know where he went to leadership school, but Plow actually bet. He bet money. He wagered in the BRA branch history says he wagered a substantial number of guilders that they wouldn't get everybody in place in time. So he was actually betting that he was going to fail. And but I'm happy to report that every gun was in location at the last minute. What we call Fort Bravo Fort Charlie. It's a long time since I've done field work, but the time that you're meant to be ready, Fort Foxtrot, that's what it is, I think. Anyway, the time that they're meant to be actually ready to fire, and he had a big smile on his face at the BRA branch history reports, and I think he had to pay out quite a bit of money to people the fact that he made it. But some of the stories of these guns moving in, there's one story where a medium battery, the roads were so bad to move into the gun position. The GPO, who's like the gun position officer, in the middle of the night had to lead the gun in one gun at a time. Yeah. By walking in front of it with a flashlight with two pieces of paper wrapped around the light and guiding it as he walked it into the gun position and onto its gun platform. Yeah. So finding a place to put them all and then getting them there was a real challenge. And like I said at the outset, that's a part of the story that a lot of people don't hear. All of this, that's the iceberg under the water that nobody really knows of, but it was all critical to the success.
Yeah, I was going to say that I've heard that story before, so it must be in one of the higher level histories. It must be in the official history, because I've heard that story where they literally have to do it one at a time with the flashlight in front. Like it's just I've heard that before, so I think it is somewhere. I can't remember where, but because I work with a lot of books on a given day, and this is just giving me the First World War, get everything into position, all of that, with an obviously big difference is because these lines are not as stabilized. So that just adds to this. Oh, this is an interesting question, if you don't mind. For some reason, the aggros are forward of the divisional artillery.
Yeah, and I picked this map up off the internet, and I haven't had a good chance to look at it in great detail. Other than what I would think is, I don't think all divisional artilleries are actually on this. For one, So they may look like they are, but maybe they're not actually in front of some other divisional artilleries.
Right.
But the Agras were also responsible for a counter battery. So they needed to be able to fire deep into the enemy, because the enemy don't politely put their guns right up on our start line so that we can engage them right away. Their guns are back as well, so we need to launch deep into their territory in order to hit their guns. And the Agras were almost primarily used in the counter battery fight, so they would naturally have to be as well forward as possible in order to get that range. And there you go. And fire deep. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sorry for anyone. The CB counter battery. Anyone unaware? Yeah, Dave's saying it's in Heavy Gun 2. It's in Nicholson, so it must be where I read it. The only thing I can think of. Cool. I think that was it. Yeah, we have some questions, but we'll get to them in
sure
as we move forward, because they don't. Yeah, this is fascinating here.
Yeah. So obviously, there, lots of ammunition was planning on being expended, and we'll talk about the numbers and the weights later. So these are the guns that were dumped on the battery, and that's rounds per gun. So if you were in a 25 pounder battery of 8 guns, and I'm not good at math here, so that's 5,600 rounds was going to be dumped on your position.
Yeah.
And Blackburn in his book, Remember the Details, talks about they don't just, I know in this picture here, they're sitting on the ground. They have to be dug in. And it's some ungodly amount of earth that actually has to be moved by hand at night in order to store this ammunition. So once again, just like the guns, this ammo had to be driven to the position at night, dropped off at night, and dug in at night, all before the sun came up in the morning, and camouflaged, and then the sun comes up. And I also want to remind everybody that none of the artillery was actually allowed to come forward. Right. So at the time, 2nd Canadian Divisional Artillery was holding the line, and they wanted to maintain the illusion for the Germans that they were the only artillery in the region. Right. And so, pardon my language, the poor bastards in 2nd Canadian Divisional Artillery did all the digging. So you know what, and so they were still keeping up their harassing fire and whatnot, their normal pace of operations. So imagine you're Gunner Smith, you had a long day and you're just about to crawl into your bunk, and like, not so fast, Gunner Smith, hop on the truck, you're going to go dig a huge trench and put some ammo in it. So the entire 1st Canadian Army and 3rd Corps and everyone owes a large debt to 2nd Canadian Divisional Artillery for actually digging this dumping program and actually getting those things buried. But you can see the numbers there, and absolutely massive amounts of ammunition. And obviously they want to camouflage them a lot, because if a German round landed on it, it'd be unpleasant for everybody in the vicinity.
Oh yeah, real bad. Yeah, it's just, again, another thing that you think about, but you don't quite conceptualize until you stop and think about it, right? Especially the digging in, that needs to be done, which is something I always forget. Not being in the military, definitely not being a gunner, I always forget about needing to dig in, not just the gun but everything else. So it's again, it's right, those poor 2nd Div gunners, they must have been swearing up a street by the end of this one.
I think the worst story I read was they dug a trench, they put 400 rounds in it, covered it up, and then the next night somebody went to check on it, and it had flooded, and all the rounds were useless. Yep. So they spent hours and lots of manpower to dig it in, and all the rounds were completely useless. Yeah,
which is not surprising in the slightest.
Yeah. Okay, so in this, now here's where I'm really going to geek out, and I'll apologize to everybody. In these ammunition dumps, what was included was the variable time fuse, which is now known as the proximity fuse. Yep. But it was always kind of known as proximity fuse. The variable time, this is a great way to stump people, and we do it to younger artillery officers all the time. Like, why did we call it variable time? And people will come up with these ideas. Well, you can vary the length of the fuse, and the only reason was so the Germans didn't know what it did. So it was always a proximity fuse, but we called it the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, because so the Germans couldn't figure out what we were working at. So I actually have to go all the way back to the 18th century and to a British artillery officer by the name of Henry Shrapnel, who realized that if he could explode a cannonball, the chunks of the cannonball coming out were actually more effective than when it kind of lands in the ground and blows up. And he then realized also, well, actually, if we fill the cannonball with musket balls and put a small charge in the middle and essentially create this floating shotgun, spraying the enemy in the air, that's even more effective. So hence the birth of the air burst munition. And you can see in the image to the right why air burst is so much more effective, especially against troops in open, but also when it bursts over top of people in trenches. So when a shell actually lands, and if it explodes when it hits the terrain like this, it bursts kind of outwards, and all the splinters and fragments are forced outwards, but also follows the inertial movement of the shell if it were in flight. So actually, and because it hits the ground hard, it actually buries a little bit, even if you've got a super quick fuse. So a lot of your splinters and fragments actually just go into the dirt right away, and so that it's not as effective. It was effective in the First World War, especially when they adopted the 106 fuse at destroying wire, which was what it was mostly used for. But against anti-personnel, it's not as effective. So up until the Second World War, they were using mechanical time fuses, which essentially are fuses that, as the name implies, there's a clockwork in it. And I won't go into all the details of the burn fuse and stuff like that and how it actually worked. But there's a natural error in that. So you would fire these mechanical time fuses, and they would burst, hopefully burst at the optimal height of burst. But any number of things could affect how high they actually burst. And so some of them would thunder into the ground, some would burst way too high. And even today, when we kind of still practice with mechanical time fuses, we fire 3 guns and see, and if 2 burst in the air and 1 on the ground, then that's close enough. And we conclude that we've achieved the proper fuse setting for the optimal height of burst. The proximity fuse was different. It originally originated as a fuse for an anti-aircraft projectile. So how it works is it projects a radar signal that measures the distance to the target, and when it reads that distance, it causes the projectile to function. And so somebody came up with a great idea, saying, well, if it can read an airplane, then we won't have these anti-aircraft shells flying off into the air, or we don't have to deal with the variance that comes with the time fuses they use.
Right.
So it started as anti-aircraft. Then they tried it against ships in the Pacific, actually, and it worked pretty well. And then somebody said, well, why don't we try this against the troops on ground? So they did some trials, and it worked fantastic. And it didn't come into the war until late. And it was, as you can see there in the first bullet, it was the first time it was used was 28 December 1944 during the Ardennes fight by 12th U.S. Artillery Group. And I didn't have space to put it here, but there were reports of 2,000 Germans being killed in one salvo of artillery using this proximity fuse. As I said, it originally was conceived as an anti-aircraft munition. And then George Patton, he actually wrote the people who developed it. And I'll read it here because it's worth reading. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad you all thought of it first. And certainly, now if he had been a gunner, he would have known it's not a new shell; it's a new fuse. Right. It's still the old shell. But again, I don't want to geek out here. But the shell was the same. It was just a new fuse, the funny fuse. And so for the first time, it was used by Canadian artillery during the Veritable campaign. That was the first time it was used. And they were still so worried about it falling into enemy hands that prior to H hour, it could only be authorized. Its use could only be authorized by Corps Artillery Headquarters. After H hour, that was delegated to the Divisional Artillery Headquarters. But a FOO couldn't just say, let's use proximity. Like, to get authority to use that proximity fuse, they had to go up the chain and say, okay, go ahead, use proximity. But yeah, so this is a novel weapon that came into the Canadian arsenal just for this battle. Yeah. Did we skip the rocket battery, or did I?
Oh,
nope.
I think
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm all messed
up. Next.
Okay, so the picture you see there is Cleve, and if you'll remember from one of the first slides, I pointed out where it is. It was a major transportation center that if reinforcements were going to counterattack, they would have to move through Cleve and for Gotch as well. Yep. So the plan was to use 1,000 fighters, 100 medium day bombers, 90 medium night bombers, 1,000 heavy bombers to drop tons and tons of munition on D-1. And Cleve, as you can see in the photo, bore the brunt of that. 1,875 tons of high explosive was dropped on Cleve. Horrocks in his memoirs recalls the story. As they were planning, Kruar came up to him and he said that Kruar asked him if he wanted Cleve taken out as part of his maneuver plan. And Horrocks didn't want to because he knew that it was still filled with women and children. But he also knew that it was a major route for the Germans to use to counterattack or to reinforce. So he said yes, and he later said that for years after the war, he had nightmares, and he said almost every nightmare was about Cleve because, as you can see, the devastation that was wrought. Blackburn again describes the bombing raid that went in on the night before D-Day, D-1. And sitting in the gun position and hearing all the planes go over, and then just the entire sky lights up, and he said, you could feel the shaking in the gun position of the bombs dropping, and it was, from a dispassionate tactical perspective, it was successful, but from a humanity perspective, it was absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
So that was the first part of the fire plan, actually, if you want to include the bombing raid as part of the tactical fire plan. But and to a degree, it was, I guess, close air support. But it was well, not close air support because it wasn't troops in contact or anything like that.
No,
it was tactical support.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's where to go about
it. So that's a great painting that I stumbled upon. So Canadian artist Alex Colville was a war artist and was actually sitting in one of the gun areas when the bombardment began. And he captured it there, and it's quite a haunting image actually. And but that's what he saw and what he painted that reflected the beginning of the bombardment. So H hour was 10:30 on the 8th of February. The preliminary bombardment begins at 0500. Kruar had sent direction in the planning stage saying, surprise is a must, and he absolutely forbade a long preparatory fire. So if we remember Vimy Ridge, for example, 20 days or even more, that slowly built up here because secrecy was so key. He did not. 0500 was when the preliminary bombardment began. So I haven't written it down, but if you read my article or you do any research, you see the number of people referring to the noise that just kind of erupted at 0500 and of over 1,000 guns just spewing forward. So at this point, all the firing begins, all counter battery, any located hostile battery was engaged. So all 1,000 opened up, and they fired for 2.5 hours straight. So they had a bit of they tried to lure the Germans to unmask their guns. So for 2.5 hours, they fired. And then at 7:30, they started dropping a smoke screen just in front of the line of departure. The intent there to make the Germans think that the infantry was about to cross the line of departure. Right. And hopefully they were hoping the Germans would then fire their defensive fire task, their SOS missions, what have you, trying to disrupt the form-up. And so they wanted the Germans to do that and then use the vast array of counter-battery, counter-mortar radars and FOOs and listening posts and various other things that they had, all to locate the hostile batteries so that they could be re-engaged. So the faint smoke screen, which was a mix of smoke and HE, went in for 7:30 to 7:40. Then at 7:40, everything goes quiet. And again, contemporary accounts say it was eerie because it just everything stopped, except for in the Second Field Regiment's gun area, one gun actually cooked off. So they had loaded their gun. And they were waiting for 7:50 for the preliminary bombardment to resume. But after 2.5 hours of firing, the barrel was so hot that it actually the round exploded in the barrel. So there was this loud explosion in the Second Regiment's gun area. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but obviously the gun was out of action. And then at 7:50, the preliminary bombardment resumes. And then at 9:15. A smoke screen started on the left flank, because if you remember the map, once the infantry moved up to the line of departure, there was pretty good observation from Germany right into the left flank. So this huge smoke screen was dropped to the left of the line of departure to screen them. And then at 9:20, the standing barrage and pepper pot began. Bane, as I said, that's French for donut, I think. I spelled that wrong. I apologize. So and then at 10:30, H hour kicks off and the infantry advance. So we could talk a little bit about the pepper pot, which I think is maybe the. We'll talk about counter battery fire.
Yeah.
I don't know. I need to go into too much detail here. But as I mentioned, 2 Canadian Corps artillery have the responsibility for counter battery up until 0500. From 0500 to H hour, 5 AGRA was responsible for counter battery. And then after H hour, it was decentralized. So they divided into 3 zones. 2nd Canadian, 5th, and 9th AGRAs each had a zone for which they were responsible for prosecuting any hostile batteries they found. Prior to D-Day, they identified 45 targets. Each were serviced during the preliminary bombardment, and they were all engaged with a concentration of fire. And the ratio of guns, so if they counted 3 guns in an enemy battery location, that meant 120 guns were fired against it. So the ratio, the counter battery ratio, was 40-1. It really goes to it speaks to this point in the war, the fire support or fire supremacy that the Allied forces had in relation to the Germans.
Yeah, it's just, again, the industrial power is on display in a mind-boggling way.
So here's the barrage. So we talked about H hour, and this is what a barrage trace looks like. So this barrage trace was actually handed out to all the regiments. It normally came on a talc piece of paper, and it went to all the regiments, all the battery command posts, and it laid out the lifts. So once again, to go back to my original point of not really conceiving the amount of work that had to go into this was delivered on D-6. So between D-6 and D-1, the command post officers and what they called the ACs, or the technicians who were working in the command post, had to take all of those lanes, divide. So it was given to divisional artillery. The divisional artillery divided their lanes between their regiments. Their regiments divided their lanes between their batteries, and the batteries divided their lanes between their troops. So in the end, a troop gets, well, here's our part of the lane. And for each one of those lifts or steps that you see, they had to calculate the firing data for their guns, for each of their 4 guns in the troop, for each one of them moving forward. And then, so by the end, the intent then by H hour, by H hour, pardon me, they had all the firing data for each one of those lifts issued to the guns. So the number 1, the detachment commander, he's got it all right there, and he's like, okay, checking his watch, and off you go, and you adjust the elevation, the fuse, and everything like that, and you carry on. So just a ton of mathematical work went into this to prepare it. And like I said, it's not just somebody kind of looking through a sight and boom, boom. it's mundane but important work.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you can see here how 2nd, 15th, and 53rd Division have their lanes. There's no 3rd Division because on phase 1, only 4 divisions actually assaulted. 3rd Division actually left 7 hours later, and they kind of followed 2nd Canadian Division and then kind of moved to the left a little bit. So you've got the 3 divisions there. So you're probably wondering where's the 54th Highland Division? Where's their barrage? And the answer is the commander of 51st Division didn't want a barrage. So he said, what I want to do is timed concentrations. So he assessed that they had located the enemy close enough, or they knew where the enemy locations were enough. And he said, I don't want to waste ammunition with a barrage. I just want to concentrate my fire on known enemy locations. So that's why there's no barrage trace for 51st Highland Division. It was a holdout in that, and it fired concentrations instead of an actual barrage. So if you look to kind of the bottom right of the the barrage, you see a series of like plus marks. That's how they would denote a concentration. So there was a whole other trace for 51 divisional artillery with all of its concentrations on it as well. So there was a great debate amongst us egghead gunners as to whether a barrage or a concentration was the better thing. And there, in a series of doctrinal notes that the BRA branch produced, there was one rather passionate article written by some staff officer in the BRA branch about what's better, a barrage or a concentration. And I won't illuminate, hit all these points, but the key thing to remember with a barrage, timed barrage, is that it's guaranteed fire support because it's moving along on a schedule. And any targets that you don't know of will be engaged as the barrage moves along. The problem is a large percentage, I would estimate 75 to 90% of the rounds don't land anywhere near a German. Because they're just in a line. And if there's no actual defense there and they just keep moving until it actually hits a German location, all those rounds are essentially wasted. And I think that's why the commander of 51st Highland Division said, well, I'd rather have all my rounds land on top of a bad guy rather than just kind of sweep through. But there's benefits to both. And you get far more of effect with a concentration. But you don't get that guaranteed fire that comes with a barrage that's moving along, even though that guaranteed fire can be dissipated over space because of that.
Yep. Here we go.
Here we go. I know this is your favorite. Sorry,
there we go.
To get there. All right. Yeah. So again, in under the topic of novel weapons, 1st Canadian Rocket Battery made not its debut, but it played a pretty big role here. Until I did my research, I had no idea how much of a lead Canadians played in actually developing rocket artillery in the Imperial armies. As you can see, the Land Mattress Party was created at the Canadian School of Artillery in the UK. Originally, it was air defenders that first equipped it. It then went to the Brits, but slightly before, in December, 23 December 1944, they formed 1st Canadian Rocket Battery, and it stuck around in the org for the remainder of the war. So what you see there is a projector. The battery had 12 projectors, each had 32 tubes, and each tube had a 3-inch rocket with a 29-pound HE warhead. They could fire a range of 4,000 to 8,000 yards. And the battery footprint was 700 square yards, so it could take out a lot of terrain, or it could land on a lot of terrain. But once again, it was most effective against troops in open. So with 29 pounds and with a relatively thin kind of lining of the rocket, when it exploded, it didn't create a lot of splinters. It created a large blast, and it was excellent in suppressing a large area. But the splinters that fly off of artillery rounds and kill people, that it didn't have as good an effect there. So they determined after practicing or testing it, that it was best used to fire against the target just before the infantry went in, because the shock value and the suppressive value was quite high. I did find in my report, so as the planning was underway for Veritable, Career, because he was involved in this at the start, he actually had a hand in creating the Land Mattress Party way back in the UK. And now that it was deployed, he wanted to see its effects. So while the plan was happening, the 1st Canadian Rocket Battery actually deployed up near 1 British Corps, which I forgot to mention. 1 British Corps was poised to the north of 1st Canadian Army, and it was maintaining the illusion that they might move northward, trying to keep the Germans guessing as to what the direction of the assault would be. So Career went up there, went into an artillery air OP, and actually watched a couple salvos from the battery, and he was so impressed with it. He said, "Yeah, I definitely want that in my fire plan." And there it was. It was deployed on Veritable. And I think you got a video you want to show.
Oh, I can't show it today. Not right this second. Sorry. I just want to get this in.
Okay, sorry.
Norma came up with this earlier, and I think I'm going to steal that now. Those mattress thingies. Not as catchy as the original name, which also is kind of confusing. Yeah, there's a video. It's linked down below. I was going to try and play it, but I was talking to Dave about this. So I tried that once before in a live stream, and it went horribly. So I'm just not going to try it.
Okay.
Everything kind of collapsed, and it was not good. But it's linked down below, and you can find it on the page. It's really interesting footage, and the story behind it is quite interesting. And it's one of those things where they basically took the leftovers, I guess is the best way to say it. That was deliberately part of it. They told them, yeah, you can continue on with this project, but don't take from anything else, which to me is utterly fascinating. But yeah,
I think Norma's question there, I'm not sure if this is what she was getting at, but these didn't fire all at the same time. But there was a half-second interval because the rockets would actually hit each other in flight, so they couldn't all fire at the same time.
Yeah, they could do it differently. Yeah, but they were fired individually. Sorry, I just had a question. Yeah, and they all come close together. Sorry, just when I was up getting the other one, I lost where we were. Yeah, there it is again. The land mattress thingy. The thingy. I need a shirt with that on it or something. Yeah, no, and just questions about it. No, it's similar to the Hedgehog, but not exactly the same. It's not the same technology, but there's a C version of it. It's called the C mattress. I mean, the names are really interesting, but
I'd love to. I don't know. Maybe you know. I have no idea why mattress.
I think because it looks like one.
Maybe, yeah.
That's the only thing I can't find anything.
It might be something like the VT round where they just said let's just choose some weird name, and
maybe
the Germans won't have a clue what it actually does.
I have no idea. Like I tried to find it, and there's one document within Library and Archives Canada that I just haven't got a chance to look at. So maybe it's in there, but my guess is because it looks like one based on how they did everything else. Names are just sometimes just sure, that's what that looks like. Let's go with it. But yeah, it's a really interesting weapon, and there's a video down below you can check out after. But yeah, this is where it was part of. Sorry, just real quick with Operation Veritable, it was used, and then it was used later on, like you said, in the Nijmegen Salient. But this is its first like big show, I guess, is a good way to play it. And here we go for the other interesting one. Yeah,
so I mentioned that at HR the pepper pot started, and this wasn't the first time a pepper pot had been used. It had been used before. But essentially what it is, if anyone's not familiar with it, they just line up, you name it, like just a hodgepodge of munitions, and they circle in big areas where the enemy might be, and they say just start shooting, and they go for hours. And as you can see there, the intent was to saturate the enemy defenses on the front and flanks of the attack and convince the enemy that it would be suicidal to move or come out above ground. So it really speaks the value, and we'll see this more later. The value of suppression. Yes. That like these chaps here they're just firing to fire. They're not aiming at anything. Like they've actually just applied a bearing and elevation that's going to get them in the rough area. And hopefully the Germans just stay in their trenches during the whole of it, because there's just bullets flying everywhere. And if anybody if you've ever had a bullet fired at you, it's an unpleasant feeling, and a bullet or a rocket, even if it's far away. So it was tremendously effective. But the numbers here, and this is just 2nd Canadian Division, because there was other forces that were brought up to do this, and 2nd Canadian Division alone fired 1.3 million machine gun rounds, 69,000 40 millimeter rounds, 14,000 4.2-inch mortars, and 12,000 17-pounders. Tanks were involved, firing indirectly. There's one story out of a light anti-aircraft regiment that they were firing so much they didn't have a cook-off, but they had to stop firing because the barrel, they said, was actually bulging, like you could see it like swell up because it was so hot. Yeah, and that's just after 2.5 hours of firing. That's hours of firing at just a high rate of fire. That shouldn't be surprised that it happened. Yeah. But this is a great picture, just showing the amount of casings that are tossed aside because they're just firing for hours at a time.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's one of those things that, I don't know, maybe this well, obviously it's different for you, but when first time I wanted to like dig in this because it's mentioned in like the official history, things like that. But I was like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? And then it took me to realize a while that it's literally just made up with whatever you have. There's no definition to the pepper pot. It's literally whatever you got around you. You just point it kind of at the enemy and just hope for the best.
Yeah,
it's just, to me, it's just fascinating.
So the attack initially went well. As I mentioned at the start, it was an ambitious plan. So even though the intent was for phase 2 to begin on 9 February and start that 2-corps advance, it actually didn't start till 14 February. So the initial bombardment was very, very effective. The initial advances were actually quite good, but eventually, once they kind of got to the Cleve area, by that point, the terrain, Germans had a hand in it as well, but most of the terrain and lack of roads held them up, and the advance slowed down substantially. So, notwithstanding this huge bombardment, after D+1 9 until the end of the actual operation, which ends. As you see there, 21 February, then now you're just reacting to local events. So the big barrage ended essentially on D+1 on 9 February, and now all the guns were just kind of reacting and individual calls for fire, dealing with strong points and localized attacks. But as they advanced, the guns had to advance as well. And as you can see, these are the conditions they found themselves in trying to drive. I know that's a 7. I couldn't find a picture of a 25-pounder being towed, but so that's a 17-pounder moving forward, I believe. Anyway, but nonetheless, those are some of the conditions that these things had to move through in order to advance. And finding gun positions that were dry was a challenge. And I forgot to mention, but the enemy had a vote in this as well. So a lot of these gun positions were littered with mines as well. Yep. So flooded areas, complex terrain, German strong points, and mines all made for a really hellish advance. So there's stories of at least one battery couldn't get into its gun area because there was no route that they could actually get into it. So they actually had to stop and fire on the road. They had to deploy the guns on the road. There was some you would find their designated gun area was littered with mines, so they had to go elsewhere. And some of there are some funny stories. So at least a couple of batteries, at least one that I read of. I can't remember the regiment from where it came from, but it deployed into a gun area. And it was a nice dry ground, but they all kind of woke up in the morning and the water had come up. And the water was so high that when the guns were firing on the 25-pounder, as it kind of recoiled, it would actually go in the water. That's how high the water was, and then it would come back up. Tongue in cheek, even the war diarist actually wrote in the war diary, said, it's a great way to keep the guns cool, but if the number 2, and that's the chap working isn't wearing a bathing suit, it can be rather uncomfortable. And there's lots of other stories of foos getting like isolated on islands. So they'll go to an OP and they'll kind of wake up in the morning and water has come up all around them. And there's at least one foo who got stranded on this island. And this was in the war diary as well. I think by this point in the war, people were having a better sense of humor. And whoever wrote the war diary said, but not to fear, he's as the waters came up, a lot of people came, and he said it was all farm animals and beautiful German women that came onto this island. So he was stranded on this island with a dozen cows and a dozen beautiful German women, apparently. So I guess he didn't have too rough of a go. But at any rate, there was a real challenge moving the guns forward, and it got to the point where they couldn't move them forward. And there's some war diaries, I think it was 2nd Divisional Artillery, they were saying we're so far back that corps is going to move into corps artillery is going to move into our right next to us here, and because the number of routes that were available it diminished substantially because of the weather and the flooding and the mines. So there were times where there was 2 divisions that had a single main supply route, and they were just clogged with vehicles, and of course they were all muddy and they couldn't move quick. So it was a real challenge actually advancing the guns as the fight progressed. Okay, so as I said, 21 February, or around 16 February, Carrera realizes that he's not going to achieve the objectives that he thought. So he started his staff planning on a sequel operation, which I can't remember the name of it, but was going to launch 24 February, I think, is what the plan. But so they kept fighting and eventually rolled over into the new operation on the 24th.
Yeah,
Blockbuster, yeah, that's right. Sorry. So we're very, very lucky from a historical perspective, is that instructors and gunnery, an instructor and gunnery team was deployed to the battlefield right around that time, and actually to inspect things. And they did this. They visited the battlefield and assessed the accuracy of fire. They actually went to the barrage lines and counted crater holes. They actually went to each battery and double checked their math in their kind of calculations, and also went to hostile batteries and actually measured where the actual MPI of things were. So there were some very interesting findings that came out of this. And I'll give you one guess as to who that handsome bloke is on the left there. But anyway, if the folks listening don't know what an instructor in gunnery is, that's the hat we wear. Instructors in gunnery, as the name suggests, instruct artillery. There it is, the famous IG hat. And they're instructors, but they're also, especially the NCOs, who we call assistant instructors in gunnery, they're technical experts, especially NCOs. Mm-hmm. So that's why after these operations, they would send IG teams to kind of conduct these assessments. So they found that the MPI, the main point of impact, was most of them was 250 meters northwest of intended targets. So that's substantially far from the target. Mm-hmm. Only 5.1% of artillery rounds in concentrations landed within 100 yards of targets. So not horribly accurate. Only 2 to 3% of German casualties were caused by the artillery. And 5 of 28 German guns that they knew of, that they could determine what happened to them, were actually destroyed. The others, 7 were withdrawn, and the others kind of disappeared. But despite this, you might look at that and say, that's not very successful. The IG report said the fire plan was conspicuously successful. We're going to get to why that is in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about predicted fire next. And again, this is my last and final geek out moment, so I apologize to everybody. So 5,953 tons of munitions were fired. That's important to know. And most of them were fired using what's called the predicted method. So fire can be either observed or predicted. Observed, as the name intends, is somebody actually sees it, and they can either, today what we use the term to adjust fire onto the target. So adjust the bearing and elevation until it hits the target, or at the time they called it registering it, I believe, or shifting the fire. Predicted fire simply calculates from the battery position to the intended target, and then a bunch of math calculations are made, and they determine using tabular firing tables and some known elements of trajectories and ballistics, whatnot, that in order to hit this target, you should fire this charge at this elevation and this bearing. And if you look at that picture on the left, there's a series of non-standard conditions that nobody can calculate away completely. Take weather, for example. 60% of inaccuracy in artillery fire is caused by meteorological conditions. So even if you compensate for air density, air temperature, wind speed, and direction, those aren't constants all the time and all the way through the trajectory. So they affect the flight of the projectile, as does charge temperature, as does the temperature of the barrel, as does human error in actually laying. How accurate are the gunners laying on their sights and whatnot. So all that causes these natural dispersions about the mean point of impact that you see here. So that's the mean point of impact. So that's the dispersion around the mean point of impact. Why is the mean point of impact further away? And it's because they didn't have the technology available to really finely determine the 5 requirements of accurate predicted fire: accurate battery location, accurate target location, accurate weapon and ammo data, accurate computing devices and procedures, and accurate MET information. So all of those errors all contribute. So that's why you saw that most of the MPIs were 250 meters away from the actual intended target. The good news is the volume of fire made up for that. So even though the MPI was far away, there was thousands of bullets, and that beaten zone was quite large.
Yep.
So that's key. So I can stop my geeking out now. But if we go to the next slide, what they did find is the density of fire cut all lines of communications. Recall back to the objectives that I stipulated at the front, that the objective was to destroy headquarters and communications. It did. It cut all lines of communications. Mm-hmm. The defenders could not communicate with each other either through radio, because it was interfering with that, or a wire communication or runner or anything like that, because they were all hunkered down. Counterfire, even if it wasn't accurate and they didn't destroy a lot of German guns, enemy fire was not a source of trouble on the day. So they were neutralized, and you remember that was one of the objectives: neutralize the enemy hostile batteries by not allowing them to interfere with our operations. In fact, I'll see if I get their numbers right. One German medium gun opened up during the advance, and they picked it up with, I think, a Sound Ranger or maybe a radar, and 4 medium regiments were fired against it. Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
so the Germans learned that not to shoot, because they knew that it would just be coming back at them. Oh, yeah. And I didn't have space to have all the testimonials, but it's included in my article. But there was the number of POWs talked about how they couldn't leave their bunker, because even if it wasn't accurate, it sounds like, well, the MPI was 250 meters away. But if you've got thousands of shells landing 250 meters away, and some closer because the beaten zone is bigger, you don't want to risk coming out of your bunker. No. And at least at one point, one POW said they waited, and when it seemed like the barrage was over, they went out of the bunker. This was an artillery battery, and they were going to reoccupy their guns. But when they came out of the bunker, their entire gun position was filled with Canadian infantry and tanks. So they were effectively suppressed and neutralized until the infantry rolled over their position. And the suppression worked as well. I don't have the point here, but the barrage did its job and moved along and suppressed the enemy. So as I said, for the phase 1, they advanced pretty well, and it was It was less the enemy and more the complex terrain and horrible road conditions that actually slowed the advance. However, one point was made. I can't remember the British regiment, the CO, off the top of my head. I apologize. But he did make an observation. He said there was too much artillery fire because he actually blamed that the slow going because the artillery churned up the muddy ground too much. And a lot of that happened in the First World War as well. And as a result, it delayed their advance because they had to drive through the muck and the churn and the craters and stuff themselves trying to advance. And he suggested that it would be much more effective if they're, rather than, even though this wasn't a long barrage, Crerar wanted a short fire plan. This CO actually said it should be even shorter. It should just be fired just before we get onto the enemy position, and then just. I think he was also arguing for concentrations, not the barrage that churns it up as we go forward. So, in the end, that's why it was conclusive. It was successful. So after my conclusion, after all my research, was that after 5 years of war, the fire support system of the 1st Canadian Army was efficient and effective. Not unlike Vimy, we had got to the point now where there was the number of guns, the network of communications, the novel weapons, and the sheer amount of munitions that had built up that enabled 1st Canadian Army to have this level of a bombardment.
Yeah.
So all of this came together and allowed the gunners of the 1st Canadian Army to execute the veritable fire plan with a calculated and terrible efficiency in the face of adverse weather conditions, complex terrain, and a depleted but nonetheless resilient enemy. And that's it.
Yeah, that's pretty fair conclusion. If it's okay, we take a few questions, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
All right, we're going to throw back, as Kevin has termed it, bonus geek. Does the 250 meters northwest MPI not indicate systematic error of some kind?
Yeah, and the IG team concluded it was MET, that the MET wasn't accurate. And I'll geek out a little bit more on that. We did have, and at that point, they had the instruments to measure meteorological conditions. The problem with measuring meteorological conditions is that it's a snapshot in time, is not consistent, changes throughout the trajectory of the gun, of the projectile, and it can get old fast. So they concluded that was mostly because of inaccurate meteorological conditions. They did find a systematic error in calculations too. And I don't know if somebody carried a 2 or forgot to do the square root of what, but at any rate, but they determined that error wasn't significant.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think just because, again, I don't know the technical aspects, but the weather, because you're telling those stories, right, about the crews being, left on an island all of a sudden. It's just, that was part of the infantry experience, right? And going forward, it's just, it got worse. It was bad to begin with, but then it got worse. Like, that's what we're talking about, Crerar, and the advance basically stalls, and while they have to do, Veritable 2 or Blockbuster, is because everything just kept getting worse and worse. Yeah, the Germans were resisting and getting heavier resistance, particularly in the forested areas, but they turned those into fortresses as well. So it slowed the advance. So it could only be, completely understood that.
One thing we should also mention, sorry, just to go along with what you just mentioned, was that we mentioned that it was inclement weather. So it rained a lot, and that deprived the Allies of their air support. So there was a couple days where the Germans basically had a free hand to bring reserves in and reinforcements because the Air Force couldn't fly because of cloud cover and rain and whatnot. Pardon me. If that, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Take a drink. The lack of air power, because again, I think Veritable. I think rain, flooded, mud, because it just First World War again obviously comes to mind, but it's just the worsening conditions of artillery plays a role, right? Because it chews up the ground. But that's funny because that observation, because I have heard that before with Veritable, but it was going to get worse no matter what anybody did, just because the weather was just that bad. Yeah, and this is an interesting point. Maybe something we can finish up is with grenade, right? You mentioned it's supposed to be simultaneous. but they couldn't do it because of the weather conditions. So it's just an interesting part. And I couldn't find anybody to talk about grenade because I wanted to find someone as a separate piece, but I couldn't find anybody. So if anybody knows, that would be awesome. You do it at some point, but I just think it's so interesting that General Simpson and the Ninth Army get like no attention for some reason. And I've just kind of wanted to dig in that, but I think that's important to remember.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Oh, and Dave, who, another gunner, makes an interesting point. Yeah. So I don't think we have any other questions, but yeah, it's just basically where you said that information becomes outdated, and then what do you do? Yeah, so thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We've been talking about this one for months now.
Yeah.
We got lucky that we could do it on the day because we weren't sure we were going to be able to. So that was great that we got to do that. Have you back on there. You got the OTD hat trick, and I'll make you your own playlist. And
nice.
Yeah, so that's awesome. And again, and you, as you know this, if you want to come on, and well, we're gonna have you back on anyway. We have plans for something.
Yeah.
For hopefully when the weather gets better here, which I'm really hoping for soon. But yeah, so we'll have you back on. So again, thanks for everyone. Everyone's
appreciate it.
Liking the show and all the detail and everything. It's great to have. Sorry, I missed a bunch of people names I don't recognize. I'm sure that has to do with you bringing them in, but lots of people were saying hi. Sorry, I missed all those, but you can check on those after. So yeah, so thanks everyone for watching.
Hopefully nobody's saying anything bad about me. I did post this in like a Facebook group for more geekiness. Hey, Mark. Yeah, so, exactly. So I did post this in a Facebook group for gunners.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
So maybe I shouldn't have, because then if I'm lying or just making stuff up, they could call me out on it. No, but it's good to see some folks.
Yeah, it's always and yeah, getting more people out to hopefully hook them into the OTD community would be stupendous. But yeah, so thanks for doing that, and thanks again. This was fascinating. As I said off the top, Veritable is something that's always fascinating to me. And of course, Dave is going to say more guns. I've been playing with an idea again, just been busy, but I'm thinking of doing maybe like an artillery week. Maybe that's something
nice.
we can see if we can do with all the gunners that have come into my life over the last couple of years. I think that's something we can. Sorry, these are funny. Anyway, so yeah, so thanks everyone for watching. If you're liking the stuff I'm doing here, either you can become a YouTube channel member or Patreon. It helps a lot to keep this going. So thanks everyone for watching, and keep tabs on all social media and things like that, and I'll let you know when the next live stream is coming through. So other than that, have a good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again.